why don't we start? I would like to welcome Ambassador John Davis, and I would like to say a few words introducing our guest today. It's not very often that we can host here people who actually not only can tell us about historic events from the perspective of observers, and very close observers, but who also were actors of these historic events, who were involved not only in observing them closely, but also in facilitating and making them. There are more than one. There is more than one story of the collapse of communism. There is definitely an American story. There is a Soviet story with perestroika and reforms, and there is, of course, a Polish story. Ambassador John Davis is a unique figure, somebody who actually participated in both, at least American and Polish stories of this larger sequence of events. So I would like to start from a few remarks. We start the Polish story in 1980 when massive waves of strikes resulted in the creation of the Solidarity movement. It was the first mass movement in the communist world which challenged the legitimacy, openly challenged the legitimacy of the communist order and of the communist regime in Poland here specifically. And it was the only phenomenon of this sort in the communist bloc at the time. It happened in 1980, but by December 1981 it became clear that the communist regime in Poland was not willing to tolerate that sort of challenge being presented against it. And it cracked down on the Solidarity movement on December 13, 1981, introducing martial law. Martial law was a dramatic limitation of human rights on such basic levels as curfews were introduced. People were not allowed to leave their towns, travel anywhere. Telephones initially were even disconnected, so people could not communicate, and any meeting of 3 people or more on a street was could be considered a public gathering, and people could be arrested for that, since public gatherings were not legal anymore. In this bleak moment in Polish history, John Davis arrived in 1983 as a new chief of the American mission. I say chief of mission, not ambassador, because at this point United States and Poland had very tense relations, and the United States did not have ambassador in Warsaw as a diplomatic gesture of its basic disagreement with the Polish regime over human rights. John Davis arrived in Warsaw as already as a seasoned diplomat. He served before in Sydney, Rome, Milan, Djakarta. In 1981-83, he was the director of Eastern European and Yugoslav Affairs Office at the State Department. But most importantly, he already had diplomatic experience in Poland. He had served previously in 1960-63 and then again 1973-76 in the Polish embassy. So now in 1983 he was to remain, which he probably didn't know at the time, but he was to remain in Warsaw as the chief of the American mission, later on ambassador, until 1990. And this was a very historic period in Poland. Well, his performance and his behavior in Poland won him a deep appreciation and respect in Polish society, and contributed to him actually securing a lasting place in Polish history. When this was the time when Ambassador Davis and his wife Helen, present here, opened their doors to a lot of people from the Polish political opposition, who were normally chased by the communist regime, and by doing gestures like this, informal gestures like this, he was sending a very subtle but also a very strong message to the Polish government, where telling this government where the sympathies of the United States were placed, and that America is standing by those in Poland who are ready to fight for democracy. It's not going to abandon them and pretend that business as usual is going on between the American government and the Polish military junta de facto under General Jaruzelski. What happened in late 1980s was a gradual process of working out some sort of peaceful solution to this now already permanent crisis in the relationships between the Polish government, which could not win the support of the society, and the society represented still and invested in the Solidarity movement, which was outlawed by that time. And Ambassador Davis played an important role as a mediator in this early phase of bringing both sides to some sort of talks, which then led to the phenomenon called Roundtable talks between opposition leaders and the communist government in Poland, which led to a peaceful arrangement of which then became gradually a transfer of power. It also served as a model for all remaining Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe, with the exception of Romania, which then followed this Polish model of roundtable talks, and by the end of December 1989, all of these countries had already the communist regimes out of power, and all of them were moving one way or another to developing democratic forms of governments, and also were establishing themselves as sovereign nations in Eastern Europe. So that was a momentous historic event, and I'll stop at this point. I won't go further. I believe John Davis will have something to say about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and it's great to be here on the silver anniversary of the Roundtable, which rose from their labors 2 days. Well, it'll be 25 years, 2 days from now. And one of the reasons I was pleased to be able to come is to defend the reputation of the Roundtable. All of you have, there's a Polish grudge. I think you're probably aware that pieces of the Berlin Wall are already being scattered around on the campus here, getting ready for the big celebrations in November of the end of the Cold War. And on behalf of Poland, I would like to say the Cold War ended right there in Poland in September when the Mazowiecki government was sworn in. We'll get to that later. Now, it was February 6th, 1989, when that group you see up there behind you sat down. And the picture on that screen, of course, carries no such emotional charge as the one of the man standing on top of the Berlin Wall with a hammer knocking it down. In fact, it looks like a typical talking shop. I mean, what possibly could emerge from a mob like that sitting around for 2 months arguing? We'll get to, in fact, that group produced a decision that both sides thought was a victory, each for itself, and that proved to be a turning point, a historical event of huge significance that, in effect, ended the Cold War on the spot. Ever since 1981, martial law was declared in Poland, the government had been ignoring solidarity, trying to pretend that it was no longer a significant group, and keeping Valenza out of the public eye. And all that ended with the Roundtable. Jaruzelski and the military regime tried everything they could think of, from attempts at economic reform to repression, to re-jailing dissidents, letting them out, trying to get the church to persuade Solidarity to give up its demands for independence, all to no effect. And finally, in the end, they had to sit down and talk. Now, I should say about, if you will forgive me, give you a 5-minute tour of Polish history, because it says something about why the changes that took place in '89 took place in Poland. There are a few themes that I would like to touch on. One is that in the 14th century, until about the 17th century, Poland was the dominant power in Northern Europe. They were the big dogs. And although from the 17th century on, they had a very tough time, and they were partitioned and dismissed from history for more than a century, the fact that they had once been a dominant power has left the Poles with no inferiority complex whatever. If you deal with a Pole, you'll find a man that you can trust and who has confidence in himself and in his nation. And I don't want to emphasize too much exceptionalism, but having spent so many years in Poland, I can tell you that they are people who are tough to deal with, but a pleasure to deal with. And because of that, and because of their national history and what they've gone through, they feel today. It's probably true that they are today, 25 years and more after the end of communism, the most successful country in Eastern Europe. And they've become that because of the thinking of the people who sat at that table behind you. Well, after Poland, a period of greatness, when it stretched all the way to the Black Sea from the Baltic, and was united in what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was gradually suppressed, carved up as a nation by the three authoritarian powers, four in fact, that surrounded it: the Habsburgs on the south, the Russians on the east, and on Prussia on the west, and Sweden on the north. Over the course of a couple of centuries, the amount of Polish democracy which let a single individual to veto any law in the parliament led to a growing weakness and an eventual dissolution of the country. They were partitioned 3 times, the last time in 1795, and disappeared as a nation for 123 years. The second theme in Polish history is that they were a Catholic nation. They were converted 1,000 years ago, and as things developed, they turned out to be the northern rampart and the eastern rampart of Catholicism in Europe. Catholicism became very closely associated with Polishness, and out of that developed, over a period of time, a belief in political miracles. First of those was, of course, the Virgin of Częstochowa in 1655, when the good monks paraded a painting of the Virgin around the walls of the monastery, and the next morning the Swedish invading armies had disappeared. This belief in political miracles was reinforced later in Polish history, when after the 123 years as what the Romantic era called the Christ of the nations, they became considered themselves, and they were also known widely as Europe, the problem of Europe, the Polish problem in every foreign ministry of Europe. In 1918, at the end of the war, rather miraculously, again from Polish point of view, all 3 of the occupying powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were defeated, one after the other. And Poland emerged as a nation. And having just got on its feet, it was invaded by the Soviet armies, the Red Armies, in 1920, and turned them back right at the gates of Warsaw, in what was immediately dubbed the miracle of the Vistula. So political miracles were there somewhere in the Polish psyche, lurking all these years. And then the interwar period ensued, and as you know, in 1939 Poland was again partitioned, this time between Germany and the Soviet Union, and again effectively disappeared as a nation, as a sovereign nation. The end of World War II in 1944, the Polish uprising, well, in the war as a whole, Poland lost perhaps a third of its total population to the Russians, and particularly the Germans and the Soviets both targeted the Polish intelligentsia and the managerial class. The Soviets, the Katyn Forest massacre of 22,000 Polish officers, wiped out, in effect, the upper middle class of Poland, or a large portion of it. And the Germans, when they first arrived in 1939, targeted the professors at the universities, doctors, and the whole class which they regarded as the leading class of Poland. when the Warsaw Uprising came in 1944, the Russians reached the gates of Warsaw, pushing the Germans back. The Poles rose up in the hope of liberating their own capital, and the Russians stopped on the other side of the river and watched while another 200,000 Poles were killed. This flower of a new generation was slaughtered. The fact of this slaughter and the occupation by the Russians which followed led to, I think, a new and a wiser attitude on the part of the Polish opposition in the post-war years. The idea of flamboyant attack on your enemy disappeared into a more cautious approach, but one that proved, in the long run, extremely effective. As Dariusz said, I came in on the Polish scene much later, in 1960, by which time the Stalinist era had passed. 1956 saw installation of a new government in Poland under Gomulka, which had a relative degree of freedom in establishing its own policies. It arose as a result of a series of strikes in 1955. The Poles avoided the fate of the Hungarians, and with the help of the church, were able to establish in Poland a certain degree, they de-collectivized agriculture, and to a degree they freed up foreign travel, and the cultural situation much improved over what it had been. But by 1960, when we first got there, disillusionment was beginning to set in again. It was clear that Gomulka was not really much in favor of reform beyond what he'd done initially. And he gradually lost control. The economic situation continued to deteriorate. There was a further uprising in 1968 by the intellectuals after we had left. 1970 by the workers, which were bloodily suppressed by the army. And then came Gierek. Gierek was the new first secretary who had lived in the West for a period and was going to build a second Poland, and do so by using foreign credits. Let me just say a word at this point about the U.S. attitude toward Poland. Poland's always been a very special subject for the U.S. foreign policy. There's a very large, perhaps 10, 12,000 million strong number of Polish Americans, Americans of Polish descent. And in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, their political influence was particularly strong because they've been traditionally concentrated in certain urban areas and elected representatives and senators, particularly in the House of Representatives. They had long-sitting people like Clement Zablocki, who became chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House, and Dan Rostenkowski, who was the head chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. These were potent people, and they, at the behest of their constituents, wanted to ensure that America took an active role in doing what it could to alleviate the plight of the Polish people. So beginning in 1956, we instituted a program, PL 480, agricultural assistance to the Polish people. And when Gierek came in 1970, that program was augmented with credits for industrial development and encouragement of the private sector to go in. In the course of the 70s, Poland rolled up foreign debts of approximately $20 billion. And Gierek did indeed build a lot of new factories and standard of living rose somewhat. But by 1975, when I was there for the second time, it was apparent again that this was not working. The money was not being well spent. I'm an economist by trade, and I spent a lot of time trying to master socialist economics. I finally concluded that it was a farce. The fact is that under the system as administered in those days, and in the Soviet Union as well, there was no way to measure the value of inputs and outputs. And it was all done in terms of physical quantities. But for whatever reason, we won't go into that in any great detail. The fact is that the economy didn't work, the system didn't work. And it couldn't be made to work. It was attempts to reform took place over and over again. So by the end of the 70s, Gierek was on its last legs. Strikes were breaking out. As Darius pointed out, one day in 1980, an electrician in Gdańsk named Lech Walesa jumped over the fence of the shipyard from which he'd been banned, and 3 days later was the most famous man in the world. So Solidarity arose like a miracle, but not without reason. The reason, one of the impelling reasons, was that in 1978, to the astonishment of everybody in Poland and the absolute delight, a Pole was elected Pope. And this, for once and all, proved to Poles that political miracles exist, because this was something no one could have conceived of. And it sent an electric shock through the society and a renewal of hope that change might be possible. And in my view, that was one of the factors that did lead Solidarity to arise when it did. Now, the U.S. was very supportive of Solidarity. We did our best during its days of legality to ensure that more aid would flow to Poland, and encouraged the Polish government of the time to work with Solidarity to bring about further reforms. But by 1981, it was clear that it was unacceptable to the Soviets that Solidarity continue. And as Darius said, on December 13th of 81, Jaruzelski declared martial law. We ran around like chickens with our heads cut off in Washington because it came as a shock and a surprise. In fact, I have a lot of sympathy for the people in Washington right now because they're running around the same way trying to respond to a shocking surprise. Nevertheless, within a couple of days, we had consulted with the Allies and come up with 3 conditions for resuming normal relations. One was lifting martial law, release of all political prisoners, and resumption of negotiations with Solidarity and the Church. When it took exactly 7 years for the regime to meet those conditions, but we never changed them. And to enforce them, we put on a whole list of sanctions against Poland. Most of those sanctions were lifted little by little over the years in exchange for the release of individual prisoners or for some other modification of the conditions in Poland, an improvement of the state of their citizens. I went back, I had in Washington, as I said, during martial law. Then in '83, their ambassador defected in '81, and our ambassador left in '83, and neither side would accept an ambassador for the other, so I somehow the moving finger pointed at me, who had been there for 6 years before, and said, "Go out and take care of things for a while." So I did. I put a couple of shirts in mine. And my long-suffering wife came with me, and we went out in '83, and first thing we did was give a reception, to see if any of our old friends would dare to turn up. There was, Jaruzelski lived right across the street, and there was a tank sitting there. And I thought, well, and the reception I got was completely bleak, nobody, way down at the very lowest level of the Foreign Office. I thought, well, let's give it a try. So Helen got out her black book and called up all our friends. And I think we invited 100 people, and about 160 showed up. Coming over the gates, through the side gates, and all around. The point is, the Poles were unabashed by martial law. It was obvious. And that all the best people were on the Solidarity side of the fence. I didn't know many of the Solidarity people in the 70s. I mean, they were not then in an outfit called KOR, and some few Solidarity didn't exist. But we knew a couple. But all of our friends in the cultural field, newspaper writers, movie producers, Andrzej Wajda, all these pals we had then, of course, all became Solidarity members and were very active in it. So they brought their friends, and Helen, who was indefatigable, and established a kind of a salon where we had movies we imported and showed films, and we'd invite all the Solidarity people and their friends, and they'd come. And it got to be kind of a, well, it got very political. And they had to get by the secret police at the gates, who didn't stop them. I have to say that for Jaruzelski. They wrote down their names, but they didn't stop them. And it became a place where Solidarity could talk and get together and talk strategy and decide on their next moves. And in the meantime, when we first got there, I went up to see Valensa the day he got the Nobel Prize, or the day his wife accepted it for him in Sweden. And there too, I found that pro-Americanism was right on the heart sleeve of every Pole. And they were so pro-American, it was embarrassing. And it was up to us to try to fulfill their expectations. I will things stayed bleak until Gorbachev came in. You could feel a bit something stirring after that. I had had feelers from the Polish government before that, and we had some secret talks about what they might do to get out of the pickle they were in. But our position was the same as we had given them publicly, and they thought about it, and then the word came back, no, they couldn't do it. But, the word of our talks had leaked to the Soviets and so on. So that was killed. That was in '83. And in '84, after things had just started getting a little better, Father Popolushko was killed. That by the secret police. He was a very charismatic young priest who had just married a friend of mine, the correspondent from ABC, to a Polish girl the week before. Anyway, he was killed, he was murdered by these two secret policemen. But you could sense something was different there than the rest of the Eastern Europe, because those two policemen were arrested and tried on public television in Poland and jailed, which had never happened in a communist country before. And I began to sense that something was moving. It was already strange enough to anybody who studied communism and it was as it was practiced, that a general should be the first secretary of the party. It was the first time that had ever happened. And not only did the army take over in Poland, but they actually tried to run the economy. They sent colonels out to each one of the voivodstva, to each state. They didn't have any luck at it, but the approach was that we, the party, is incompetent and we, the army, can do the job. Well, they couldn't do the job either, but they gave it a shot. Anyway, after '85, Gorbachev and the advent of Gorbachev, the air one began to sense that it was possible to make some moves, and the oppression of martial law gradually lifted, and we tried to show our support. For example, when there was a terrible Chernobyl atomic disaster, Poland, I got a call from a friend of mine at the Polish Atomic Energy Commission saying that their monitors weren't working, they were too old, they'd been sitting in the ground forever, and they hadn't heard anything from the Russians. So I got the American atomic energy people to come over and monitor the radiation all over Poland, and it was clear that Poles appreciated it. And likewise, when a Polish airliner crashed, it was a Russian plane, and there were a couple of Americans on board. It crashed just outside Warsaw. I went out to the crash and then got the people from FAA to come over and help with the investigation. And the FBI people came, the lab people, found themselves working in the same basement, cheek to cheek with the secret police of Poland in their laboratory there. But this kind of thing helped to ease the atmosphere slightly. But through all this, although each one of these sanctions was lifted at the time, things like fishing and the rights to fly to the United States were kept in place. The one sanction that, as an economist, I was sure was effective, and that was that we would not allow any renegotiation of the Polish debt or issuance of new credits in the Paris Club. I always suspected this had something to do with getting the Roundtable started, but I didn't find out for sure until quite recently when I found the Politburo minutes from December 1988, Jaruzelski saying that the most important thing is that they, the U.S., take their paw from the Paris Club. They have us by the throat. And this was, of course, the Politburo's discussion of whether to go ahead with the Roundtable talks. So the talks got started after General Kiszczak, who was the Minister of Interior, went to see Valenza in the middle of 1988, made the suggestion. I think it was suggested in terms of solidarity could get re-legalized in exchange for helping in joining the government to, firstly, stopping the strikes, and secondly, cooperating in a forthcoming economic reform. There were all, I don't know the details of that conversation, but the idea got into the air. And as the time drew nearer, opposition arose within the party in the Politburo. And finally there was a showdown in December, and Jaruzelski and the Minister of Interior, Kiszczak, both generals, and General Shevitsky, Minister of Defense, and Rakovsky, who was Prime Minister, maybe not at that time. Anyway, they all threatened to resign from the Politburo unless the talks were started. And they won, and the Central Committee voted to go ahead over the opposition of what was known as the cement. The cement were the local officials and the hardliners generally who were afraid, quite rightly, that things would get out of control at the Roundtable. The other one who was in opposition was the chap who ran the formal trade union, the official trade union, Mr. Miodowicz. And he decided to strike off on his own, and he invited Valensa to debate with him on television. This was in December of 1988. Valensa hadn't appeared in public. I mean, I have on my wall at home a drawing done by a cartoonist friend of mine. It shows you weren't allowed to publish a picture of him in Poland or to mention him in the press. He was a real non-person. So this picture on my wall, it shows him, a drawing of him, and it just says underneath, portrait of an unknown man with mustaches, second half of the 20th century. Anyway, Miodowicz invited him to debate on television, and the party went crazy. Decided he was a rebel, but after a lot of argument, they agreed to it. And Valensa, Miodowicz is a smooth talker and a TV personality. People of Solidarity were quite worried whether Valensa was up to the job. And in fact, they came to me beforehand and said, oh, you know, very hard to get, like, to listen carefully to what we're telling him to say, and we're afraid it would make him look foolish. I told him, just get him on there. Doesn't matter what he says. The next morning, he will have won the debate. And that's exactly what happened. They got on, and, well, Valensa held his own, but the next morning, the government polls showed that more than 65% of the population supported Valensa's position over the official position. So anyway, after that little bump in the road, the Roundtable got started. And what were they trying to achieve? Firstly, Solidarity's ambition, the first and most important thing was to get Solidarity recognized. The second thing was to get representation in Parliament sufficient to make their position public. Thirdly, the right to publish newspapers, and in that order. They considered the registration, Valensa considered the registration of the union the #1 thing. On the government side, the objective was to get Solidarities, to stop the strikes, and to support, probably in the form of getting into a coalition with the government, to support in Parliament the necessary tough economic measures to save the day, and 3, by doing so, getting the rest of the Western sanctions lifted and getting the credits flowing in. And they sat down together, and they had their opening speeches in February, and they broke up into 13 groups, covering every conceivable aspect of Polish society. And they debated every night. The opening session was on television, national television. It was unprecedented. Everybody watched. And the following sub-sessions, particularly the political committee, usually resulted in the two spokesmen coming out and describing to the public what had happened. Well, the spokesman for Solidarity was Professor Goremek, Bronislaw. Brilliant man, very close friend. And the spokesman for the government was Professor Raykovsky, who was also a very decent guy, a sociologist, who was taught here at Stanford and other places afterwards. And both of them were very eloquent, and the result was almost like listening to Thomas Jefferson describe what a democracy should be. It was a tutorial for the whole nation about what Solidarity hoped to achieve, how they hoped to achieve it, how to build a society that was fair, just, free, and open. And it was quite inspiring. And we were in very close touch, particularly with Solidarity, all through these negotiations. There were many ups and downs, and delicate balancing, but by about 1st of March, it became clear that the government had miscalculated. Firstly, they granted, they broached the idea of having a Senate, bicameral, just as the US does, and that the Senate would be freely elected, two members from every state, or Boyostville. And that was fine. Then they suggested that this be a first past the post and not be proportional. I mean, you had to win each seat separately. They weren't going to be split. Fine, that was fine with the government. They agreed to that. And then they divided up. They tried to divide up the seats in the parliament, the lower house. Solidarity was given 35%. They could contest freely. And the party took 38% for itself. And the other two parties, which had been the little lapdogs of the communists ever since 1948, were given the rest. And I remember one night they came over to see me and described, my Solidarity friend, described this deal. And I said, you mean PZPR didn't insist on a majority for itself in the park and the same? And they said, no. I said, well, I think you should just ignore all the rest of the little problems in front of you and get to the elections immediately. And just to make sure I'm being honest with you, I brought along, I don't know if you've ever seen this American View of Poland and the Democratic Revolution, 1989. This is a CD put out from George Washington University that has all the U.S. Embassy cables from that year on it. And although most people said they didn't know how the election was going to come out, and on April 19th, I sent one in saying, well, I'll just read one or two lines. The elections in June are for the regime an unpredictable danger, and for the opposition an enormous opportunity. The authorities, having staked a great deal, are hoping for some modest success, but they are more likely to meet total defeat and great embarrassment. That's all. And then we go on to say they won't win any seats in the Senate, which they didn't. Solidarity won them all. Solidarity, in fact, won such a strong margin in the election that the government, Jaruzelski, decided he would not run for president. Part of the deal was to make him president to reassure the Soviets that the streets weren't going to start running with blood. But his name was crossed off by more than 50% of the people. He felt humiliated. The same thing was true of most of the reformers with him. So they all pulled back and said, no, just then President Bush came in, and Solidarity was worried. We were all worried about what was going to happen. And they asked Bush if he could do something with Jaruzelski to persuade him to run. So I was there for the conversation. I won't say that the president asked Jaruzelski to run, but he certainly flattered him and talked about his political duties and so on, and the difficult time that he might find, and he did decide to run. Then Solidarity came to me and said, how in the world, now we're in the pickle, his own people won't vote for him, and we don't want to vote for him, you know. I don't want to get on record as having voted for him. So I said, well, you have to do some nose counting, and I scribbled all these numbers on the back of a matchbook. I said, you have to get somebody up in the balcony keeping track of who's voting for whom, and that way you can have the very minimum number of people from Solidarity who have to make the sacrifice to vote for the general. That's exactly what they did, and they wound up with one vote, majority, and became president for a year, and behaved, I must say, impeccably as president. He resigned as leader of the Communist Party, and took up his role as president. And when the time came, it became apparent that no communist could form a government. He called on Mazowiecki to do so. And from that day forward, Cold War was pretty much at an end. Let me just see if I can show you a couple of pictures. There's the Roundtable again. This is us with Valenza on the day he got the Nobel Prize up in Gdansk. Well, looking pretty young there, I must say. This is Helen with Kuron and Miknik, two of the greats of Solidarity. This is President Bush when he came at our residence. This was in 1987, his first visit as vice president. And from the left, that's Bujak, the head of the underground, Polish, the underground Solidarity until 1985. Adam Miknik, Kuron, the president, Valenza, translator, Janusz Onashkevich, who was the Minister of Defense under Solidarity, and Goremek, who became foreign minister later. And then this is Mazowiecki, who was named to be the first non-communist Prime Minister of Poland. He was a Catholic intellectual, a good friend who just died this year. And it took a long time forming his government. And finally came before the Polish Parliament on the 13th of September to announce the government, and started his speech, and they got about 45 minutes into it, and he stopped, and he turned to the speaker and said, excuse me, I don't feel too well, and walked out of the Parliament. And you can imagine this tremendously dramatic moment in Polish history. The reaction, I was sitting in the gallery next to the Russian ambassador, the Soviet ambassador. And we looked at each other. He was making the best of things, as he did in those days. But Mazowiecki went out for a stroll. He was out for about an hour, and he came back and went on speaking. It was a collective sigh of relief that went up all over the country. And in fact, as a diplomat, I have to say that, you know, the tendency is you go to a post for a couple of years and you come out, and history goes on, and then you go somewhere else, and it's all very interesting, and you try to make a difference. But in this case, you know, it was, I could see from all the way from 1960 to 1990 the arc of the destruction, self-destruction of communism, and could see who the actors were. Adam Michnik said, when he goes around the world, he goes to Moscow, and they take credit for the end of communism. So he goes to Washington, of course, we take credit for it. Poland and Warsaw, they take credit. Everybody, it's typical that success has a million fathers. But the point is, as an individual, to see your friends come out of jail and go into the government, and to see the shame of the old time, which has been kind of a shadow over American diplomacy all these decades, suddenly lifted. I could look my Polish friends in the eye and say, well, we always said the only reason the Yalta didn't work is because the Russians didn't carry out their part of the bargain. Now their part of the bargain has been carried out. Free elections have been held. And that was it, of course. So what happened after that? After, you know, we've got now a non-communist government in Poland, and away they go. And to great success after many tribulations. But was the formula of the Roundtable useful? I think so. It was copied in the short run by both Hungary and to some degree by Czechoslovakia, and in Bulgaria. As Darius mentioned, Romania was quite another story, because there the party was seen as an indigenous phenomenon, not one imposed from outside. Ceausescu made the mistake of becoming so independent that the people blamed him, not the Russians, for their plight. But I would also say that it had an influence in South Africa, that this technique of sitting down with your enemy and working out what seemed to be intolerable problems, insoluble, could be used with appropriate preparation if there's pressure on both sides to get results. Now, what about today? I don't know. Certainly every international dispute is going to be settled by negotiation eventually. We're not in a position, any of us in a nuclear age, to get in a shooting war. So what's the nature of a roundtable you could have? Now that Mr. Putin seems to have been breaking all the China by grabbing territory from another country. I think you'd have to have a conference. I mean, all roundtables have been domestic problems, people within one country. So the first step would have to be getting Russian agreement to return sovereignty of Crimea to Ukraine. And I don't think that's impossible at all, as part of an overall settlement, which would guarantee the rights of all the minorities by international monitors or whatever, and would create semi-autonomous zones in Ukraine, including Crimea. I mean, this is one, the Russians have been using this technique up to now, in fact. I mean, if you look at Transnistria, it's been sitting there for 20 years, this enclave. It looks like kind of a nostalgia, Stalinist little group of people on where the 14th Army is retired on the Dniester River. And Kaliningrad, former Kaliningrad, now Königsberg, I guess. All of these things are not insoluble, but the one thing I would say, I've been retired for many years, but you can't just let them have the Crimea. If they insist on including Crimea into Russia, then there has to be long-lasting, permanent sanctions against them that make an impact. But there's no reason that this thing can't be resolved other than that on the Russian side the decisions seem to be entirely in the hands of a single man at the moment. But that's just one of the problems we have today. The fact is that we have all solved much more difficult problems. Not many of you, in fact none of you here remember the 1930s. I do. I was a kid, of course, but I can remember that there was a feeling in those days that somehow these authoritarian regimes were much more efficient and capable of making decisions quickly and carrying them out, and that democracies seemed to be unable to respond, and it took too long and too much consultation. Well, none of those authoritarian regimes are around today. So in the long run, I think there's no reason to be disheartened. We just have to bear the burden and pay the price and hope for a good outcome. Well, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. I'm sorry I rambled on for so long.
I'll go ahead and ask the first question. Okay, you mentioned that a reason behind trying to push Jaruzelski through to become the president after the Solidarity won the election, and Jaruzelski himself realized that would be just ridiculous proposition. Was that a worry that the Soviets might still intervene?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So
throughout the whole period that hung over.
Right.
People now say that's ridiculous. They never would have. Yes. You could show from the minutes in Moscow that they never really considered intervening in that period, and it probably was out of the question. But that's not what we were worried about in Washington or in Washington. We were worried about the overthrow of Gorbachev. Mm-hmm. And that came along in 1991. And by then it was too late for the hard cement to take over in Russia, but they could have done it at any time. And, you know, what can you tell? You have to read history forward, not backward. And there was a great deal of caution and worry. Because all the time with Eastern Europe was the underlying understanding that if things went bad and blood flowed in the streets, we couldn't really do anything about it. We were not prepared to go to nuclear war with Russia or Eastern Europe. And I told my Polish friends that over and over again. I said, no, you know, and they understood perfectly. That's why they were so brilliant in maneuvering as they did.
I was going to ask you this question. Was there any particular moment when you realized that the Soviets won't intervene? Was there a moment, or was it a sort of a gradual process when, so you can't capture one moment when you realized that
Well,
they won't come?
I think I finally realized that the day Mazowiecki's government was voted in, it was 402 to 0. All the communist, almost all the communist deputies voted for it too. And as I say, I was sitting next to the Russian ambassador, Brolokov. I said to him, you know, interesting day. Oh yes, well, one should think best. And I noticed that about 9 months later, he was back in the Soviet Union, he was a Ukrainian actually, he was in the Ukrainian, and railing against Gorbachev. Having threatened the existence of the Soviet Union, well, he was right there. Well.
Okay, any more questions?
If you ever think about going in the Foreign Service, I recommend it. Go to a place like Poland. It's fun, and the people are great, whether they're good times or bad. You can't always depend on things coming out well. You can always do what you can to move them forward.
Yeah, I just want to express my appreciation and thanks for your service and for this extremely illuminating presentation that you gave today. Because, you know, it's interesting. As you know, there is still discussion in Poland, you know, on the subject, you know, how much the so-called post-communists have the influence on the social life in Poland and economic life. Because you could clearly show up that out of the 10 most rich Poles, about 8 of them have been collaborators of the Polish security services, and that's sort of well proven. To which extent it differs. Some of them were extremely active, some of them might have been peripheral, but nevertheless, the fact of their economic and social success rests with the fact that they were accommodating to the post-communists, right? Okay, in some ways, you know, to this day, you can clearly see the discussion in Poland. Well, you know, the Solidarity activists are, you know, resting on extremely poor pensions, while some of the former dignitaries in the Polish society are doing quite well, okay, even on the pension side. So there is this discussion when it was a time really to introduce, was it right to introduce so-called fat line or gruba kreska, as they call it, right? Again, which let's forget the Portuguese. And was it the time, in your opinion, in the history of Poland, you know, this, let's say between 89 and 92 or so, or 91, when actually the society would have been braver in some ways to produce something that would be called decommunization, something similar to what has been done much more effectively, so it seems, in the former East Germany.
Well, no, I was a great proponent of the thick black line. One of the reasons things worked as well as they did and went as smoothly as they did was that nobody brought out the guillotine. You don't negotiate with somebody who has all of the guns by saying, give me your guns and I'll kill you with them. That's what you're saying.
I'm asking a question. Really,
I know this. The thesis is that the bad guys all got the goodies, that they now run the country, but that's not so. You know that's not so. My opinion always was that there was a very low percentage of people in the party who were capable of surviving in a capitalist society. And I'm not so, I don't know where this statistic of 8 out of 10 comes from, but I suspect that nothing like 80% of the successful businessmen and politicians and artists and whatever else in Poland are former informants of the UB. And if they have a file that says they were an informant, it's probably made up to begin with, because the UB spent a lot of time creating files to, as you well know, to discredit people. So I am of the view that although I know Mazowiecki didn't mean when he said we're going to draw a black line, that we're going to forgive everybody their sins, nevertheless, it's a very Catholic approach, if that's what he did mean. And in Poland, what happened is that I think the bureaucracy, the secret police, the secret service, the army, all were delighted to get rid of Russian influence. And everybody kept working. The government continued to function. I took Senator Dole and his wife to see Mazowiecki in his first day in office. And of course, there are the same people guarding the door that have always been there. And, you know, that's, when I flew with Mazowiecki to Washington, there were the same protection of the government people that protected Jaruzelski in his day, the Secret Service. So they didn't have to destroy the country and recreate it. I mean, it kept going. And they held together through some terribly, terribly difficult economic reforms, awful dip in individual personal sacrifices that had to be made to get Poland to the condition it's in today. So I know they're still after, they're going to be after Jaruzelski when he's in his grave, but I can tell you, I have nothing to say about how he behaved in 70 or 81, but I know that when I knew him in 89 and 90, he really behaved impeccably, impartially, did his best to get Poland moving on a new course. So. Anyway, thanks very much.
Questions?
I'll come back in another 25 years.